Hi there. My name is John. I am 30 years old, and this is my ExJW story. Um, I want to say at the outset that I'm not really going to get too much into my experience as a witness because I think that you've probably, if you're an XJW, you've probably seen enough of those videos by now, and a lot of us have had similar experiences. Um, but I will talk a little bit about my experience growing up and everything. Um, but I want to focus a little bit more on my life since leaving. Um, yeah, I grew up as a witness. I was born into the organization. My parents are both have both been devout witnesses their whole lives. I think my grandparents on my dad's side converted when he was like 6 or 7, something like that. So spent pretty much their whole lives in. I have a few siblings, and um, yeah, we all grew up, together in the organization, going to meetings. My dad was an elder for most of my life, so yeah, we kind of had the very devout experience. I guess I had some a little bit of the the elder's son experience that others have talked about, and yeah, I guess it was an interesting way to grow up. But I guess I'm just going to go ahead and fast forward to when I left. I left because of something traumatic that happened, which I'm not going to go into detail about, but happened in 2019. And so I left at the end of 2019, around 2020. And it was a real shock leaving the organization, especially at that time, just before COVID hit. Like it was very shocking. I don't think I was fully prepared for what it was going to be like, and I think I'm still dealing with the consequences of not being fully prepared. But um, yeah, it was definitely an interesting time to leave. Um, I pretty quickly I reached out to people that I felt comfortable with, and who were very supportive to me in my leaving journey, and they opened themselves up to be there for me. If I needed support or if I needed someone to talk to and things like that. And so I found some friends, some connections, people that I had known in the past, and new people as well. And that was really very helpful. And yeah, I started dating, and uh, sometime after leaving, maybe like a year after leaving, so I guess it was in 2021, I moved to the East Coast, and I started doing activism because I became very concerned about the climate crisis. And I started doing climate activism, nonviolent climate activism, which involved getting arrested and um, breaking the law nonviolently. And that was definitely a huge, you know, experience. It was a huge moment, in my life. It was like a year and a half that I did that, basically full time. I lived in a van for a while. I and then moved to DC, lived in like Airbnbs, and then someone offered their house for us for me and another person to stay in, and we basically organized climate activism there. We made it into the mainstream news. We were we got an interview on Fox, and then interview like stories in all kinds of online journals, like I think even the New York Times covered it, the New Yorker, like Yahoo, um, all the big websites covered this group. And yeah, I left in 2022 around August, September, and it was just too much for me. The pressure was too much, and I had to move back home. And I moved back home with my parents, and actually started going to meetings again, because that was the deal, that I would go to meetings, um, if I lived with them, and so that was definitely a shock for sure, to go back to meetings. So I guess what I want to focus on more, because about 6 months afterwards I moved out, and I didn't really go back to meetings much after that. But I want to focus on like my spiritual journey, I guess, because I think that that might be of the most value to you if you're um, watching this and you're not really sure, what's next, in terms of spirituality, or if you feel like you just want to completely give up on spirituality altogether. I totally understand that. So I want to talk a little bit about my experience of spirituality since being in the organization, leaving it, and now. Um, um, I was definitely devout when I was younger. Like I definitely believed it, and I was filled with a lot of shame because I would, like watch porn and things like that, and I very firmly, held to the teachings, but I would say like maybe a year or two before I ended up leaving, maybe a few years, I started doing a little bit of exploring sources that weren't really approved of, and I kind of started, slowly, quietly, just by myself exploring these things. Like I started watching Mormon Stories podcasts. I don't know if you've ever watched that, but um, I liked it, and it kind of gave me license to question a little bit, because they were talking about people that were questioning from the Mormons, and it wasn't, you know, questioning, JW stuff. Um, so I watched that, and I also read this book called Falling Upwards by Richard Rohr, Rohr. I'll put it in the description as well. Um, Falling Upwards, and it's about the first half of life. Um, it's about what he calls the second half of life, spirituality, and it's basically talking about how many times with people who grow up in very religious, households, or just however, you grow up thinking that the world is a certain way, and then you have, kind of experience which opens you up to another half of your life, another way of seeing the world, and that's what that book is about. And it really planted some seeds and really opened my eyes a little bit that there are, other things to think about, other things to consider. Um, and so I guess I was doing some of this exploration. Um, well, when I left the organization, I became an atheist for several years, and I read all the new atheists. I read Richard Dawkins, and I read some of Sam Harris stuff, and I listened to what Christopher Hitchens was saying, and I watched Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, and sometimes I still do, but I was really firmly in that camp. Like, okay, you know what? There's nothing beyond the material. The material is really the only thing that there is. There is no God, um, and that provided some comfort for me. It was kind of someone mentioned once that it was kind of like maybe it was like a cleansing for me, um, and I think it's something that Simone Weil, a philosopher, said that atheism is like a purification for someone who's grown up like in some kind of fundamentalism or something like that. So it wasn't all bad, but I will say that it left me very empty, and it left me feeling very much like kind of obsessed with, and I think it went hand in hand with um, the way in which I approached the activism work, was that I became very obsessed with outcomes. very obsessed with, trying to make things perfect and trying to save the world, quote unquote, and because I felt like if, I guess it was the thing about atheism is that it doesn't really prepare you for death. um, and I think that um, now I believe that life is in many ways a function of being able to confront death and being able to be prepared for it, on some level. And I don't think that atheism, can really provide that because um, it doesn't really have anything to say about it, you know, um, because it's a fixation on the material. So I guess I was very preoccupied with death and with apocalypse, and um, very terrified of it, but also just extremely, extremely distressed about it. Um, and that too, I think, is can be a cleansing. That kind of distress of like not being able to sleep and just constantly, thinking about it, worried about it. Because I do think that it is a natural response, to be extremely concerned, about um, the ways in which our society is going. But I don't think that you can live there for very long. I think that you really do need some kind of transcendence, and so I kind of hit the limits of what the atheism was able to provide, and so I found the need to move on to other kinds of ways of seeing the world, and I think that it was positive actually that I started going back to meetings because it reminded me that there are other ways of seeing the world that is not just the material. Um, and so I did start reading the Bible again. Um, and I started looking into Buddhism. I started reading books about Buddhism. I would practice meditation. I try to practice it still. Um, but I was also reading the Bible, and I feel like this was a really good combination, and it has been for some time. This kind of combination of reading about Buddhism, doing meditation, and also um, reading the Bible, reading about the Bible. Um, and I stumbled on this book. It's called The Zen Teachings of Jesus by Kenneth S. Leong. And this really crystallized. I read this earlier this year, so it was pretty recent actually, but this book really kind of crystallized a lot of the things that I had been thinking about, a lot of the things that I had been considering. I started reading a lot of Richard Rohr's books, listening to them, on audiobooks, and they really helped me to get a different dimension of Christianity, one that was not so literal, one that was more allegorical, symbolic, um, and these things, really helped me to, not need to be so um, bound to literal interpretations that I had grown up with, and have the freedom to kind of question things more and be open to different layers of meaning. And it's been very um, enlightening, very eye-opening, and I think that I appreciate the Bible so much more than I ever did when I was young. It was very cheap to me when I was young because I would get it every day, instruction about how to think about the Bible, and it was very common, to me, I guess you could say. But now I look at it and it's like reinstilled with magic, you know, because like I see different layers of meaning to the stories, to um, to Jesus and his life and his parables and his tales, and you know the Book of Revelation, for example. You know, the story of Adam and Eve. You know, a lot of these things they've been reinstilled, reinjected with a meaning, and I really treasure these things now, and I think that they have been preparing me for, you know, the next life, whatever that is, but also being able to find peace and deal with this life um, as well. You know, this book, the Zen Teachings of Jesus, in the last chapter, it talks about a new paradigm, you know, a new way of seeing um, the stories that we've been told from our youths. And it talks about how there there is an inner and outer meaning to sacred texts. And I think it's very true that you know, Jesus said, I'm sure you'll remember if you're an ex-JW or someone who's grown up in the Christian tradition, that Jesus, there's a verse where he says that he spoke to the people in parables because otherwise they wouldn't understand. But he spoke to his disciples, his apostles, more plainly. Like he told them more, I think is something along those lines, is what the verse says. But, you know, he had to speak to the people in parables. So I think that there is an inner meaning in a lot of these stories, or I would say like the vast majority of them. There are different layers of meaning, like an onion that you can peel away, um, and you know, be able to get at, you know, other ways of seeing that are not literal and are not like um, um, yeah, locked into any kind of um, determined, you know, worldview. I guess what I have embraced now is what has been called for many centuries mysticism. Um, you know, Christian mysticism, but there's also all kinds of other mysticism. In Islam, Sufism, right? Buddhism is essentially a kind of mysticism, and that's why I love it so much and identify with it. Um, but yeah, there's mysticism. There's Jewish mysticism. There's mysticism in essentially all the great religions. The Eastern religions are just already more mystical, if you want to use that word, than the Western religions. But there is that strain, that tradition, in basically all the great religions that are on that side, which is seeing God as something transcendent, not as a specific person or thing necessarily. I mean, you can still see him as a person, and Christian mystics often do. But it's essentially embracing the fuzziness of these stories, the ambiguities, the contradictions, the absurdities, you know, um, and finding the meaning that those elements point towards. Um, so yeah, I don't know if this has been of any value to you, but if it has, leave a comment. You know, drop a like, and let me know, you know, what your spiritual journey has been like, because I think it's something that in the ExJW world, at least from what I've seen online and on Reddit and things like that, people are often hesitant to talk about it. You know, if you talk about God in the ExJW Reddit, people will dogpile on you immediately and, you know, like, you know, shit on you for not seeing things rationally. Um, but I am curious because I do think that a lot of us that have left the organization are still very much spiritual or religious or open to that. Hope you have a good day. Hope you take care, and I guess I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye.